Thanks for joining us today. Rosie, I don't know if you wanted to introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself, and then we can get things going.
Thanks, Molly. Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm a Deputy CEO, so I look after some of our services, also the charity Safeguarding. And welcome everybody who's joined us today, and thanks for coming along. We look forward to having a sort of catch up over some of the topics that Molly's mentioned. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Thanks for joining us. So I want to introduce myself quickly. My name's Molly, as you can see. I work here at Bipolar UK, and I manage our remote peer support services. So that's things like our peer support line, and our e-community chatbot, some parts of the website, etc. You may have seen me on the webinars before or doing Facebook Lives as well. So if you've never attended a webinar before, welcome, and if you have, welcome back. So as I said initially, when myself and Rosie were talking about this, we wanted it to be a little bit more kind of casual. I think sometimes Christmas can be overwhelming and formal enough. And so we've written a little list of topics that we're going to discuss, and we're going to try and cover as many as we can. But obviously, if you have anything else that you want to add, do you have any questions, anything like that, pop it in the chat and we'll come to it at the end. I think the first thing I know we talked about, Rosie, when we met was the kinds of things you need to do in advance of the Christmas period. So any kind of like preparation, any ideas you've had, or anything from your own experience that you found helpful before Christmas even begins.
Yeah, so just to share, I live with bipolar, so my kind of journey is in kind of those challenges that you can find around Christmas, and that sometimes is around visiting other people. If you get invited over, you get invited to stay, then it's kind of having something that you feel able to manage as well. So maybe that's finding a space for you to have some alone time. And that can be just getting up extra early so that before the house all gets up and gets into the swing of Christmas or Christmas Day or those few bank holidays, that you have a bit of alone time. Might be something that you can plan into that sort of visit. Getting out, getting for a walk, if that's feasible. So just sort of thinking about what keeps you a little bit well, in terms of the lack of sort of pressure and intensity that, you know, being with a crowd of people that maybe you're not used to. And I think since the pandemic, I think socializing with larger groups, if it is larger groups, that can be quite challenging. And it's something to just bear in mind that if that is something for you that kind of you find a little bit more stressful, a little bit more anxious about, it's just how do you plan in your coping strategies around that, really.
Yeah definitely. I mean, I think I found the same thing. Is I mean, I know we've kind of, you'll know this because we work together, but Christmas for us is non-denominational, but it still involves a lot of spending time with other people and doing kind of like festive activities. And I think sometimes you can really overwhelm yourself. And I was having a think before we spoke today about how you kind of plan for that. And I think for me, it's about starting as early as you can. I know that people hate when you put up like a Christmas tree in October or whatever, but I think just having a bit of space and time to plan that in advance is really helpful. And like you're saying, planning in like alone time, self-care. Just so people know, I have a loved one with bipolar. I have a parent with the condition. And so planning in that self-care, particularly if Christmas is a triggering time for my loved one, is really important, because it means that I can like build up a bit of a stable foundation for myself, so that when I'm offering that support to them, it makes me feel more prepared. You know, and I think that is really important. Another thing, and again, Rosie, I don't know if you find something like this helpful kind of from your own perspective, but with my loved one, we do a kind of a bit of wellness planning for them as well. So like knowing if we're going to travel, what the local crisis numbers are, looking and seeing if like anything's going to be triggering that happens that close to the festive season, and particularly around some of the things we'll talk about today, like darkness, alcohol, lack of service provision over Christmas, etc. I don't know if there's anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Molly, is having those preparations. So I think things like we chatted about the other day was when we were just putting the list together, is like preparing to have your medication that you don't run out over Christmas, and making sure that, you know, things do shut down a little bit, services do close down a little bit over that period. So it's just making sure that you've got access if you need it, or you've updated your prescriptions in December just ahead of the holidays, so that you don't run out, or you don't have the stress, because it's quite stressful trying to get last minute medication. And also chemists run out. So it's good to think about those sort of things ahead of the time as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know my loved one ran out of medication recently, and it was terrifying for them. You know, they were so worried they were going to become, it'd only been a day or something, but because they're so sensitive and they've been on the medication for such a long time, it was really terrifying for them that they'd run out, and they were really panicking, and it had this massive impact on their well-being, and unfortunately meant that things escalated to a bit of a crisis point very quickly. And that's hard at any time of year. But I think when you're in, like you said, you're in that time when everything is kind of shutting down, it can be a bit of a, oh no, help kind of moment. And it's no fun any time of year when it's dark, when there's so many other triggers happening, you know, it makes it really tough.
yeah, definitely. And I think as well, my one tip, I might take this off actually. I feel a bit like overwhelmed with the Christmas hat, and I'm getting a bit hot. Um, I think one of the key things I'd say is don't assume other people are going to understand you or understand and get what's going on for you living with bipolar. And I think that can be something that you can expect other people to understand, but they might not. So I'd kind of say that is don't assume people are going to get what's going on for you at that point, and understand, because I think I think it's really important that if you're you know your triggers, and you know some of your insight into what's going on for you, is just remember that and try and keep in touch with that, because that can probably help you stay well as well. Uh, and using things like mood scale, for example, and using the mood app, but just monitoring your mood during that period, you might start to notice if it's escalating quite quickly, or it's going in the other direction. So if, you know, I know the period after Christmas, as like you've mentioned, the dark nights and that, I think the sort of January, February period just after Christmas can be really, really triggering for a lot of people, because it is that sort of, feels a bit of a slug, I think, after that. A slug? No, slug. I think it feels a bit of a slug after Christmas with the kind of darkness, and I think I noticed by the end of February, I think I start to feel it. So it's that sort of trying to maybe think of things that you can help manage your time, or manage some of the activities you might do which take place in daylight, so that you maximize your kind of access to daylight, rather than kind of having sort of like finishing work and you're still in the dark. So
Yeah.
those sort of things I think are important, because it can feel quite intriguing. I think it feels quite closed in after you spend sort of like 3 months in the sort of darkness of the reduced hours, the reduced daylight hours. So,
Yeah, hugely so. I was talking to someone about it the other day, actually, that feeling of like you go to work at night and you come back from work at night, you know, it's like, it feels like never ending darkness.
yeah.
You know, and I think that can be very difficult. And I think what you're saying about like sharing your own knowledge of your condition is really important, and probably leads us on to the next thing that I know we wanted to cover, because it was mentioned in our overspending webinar. Dr. Thomas Richardson mentioned it. I think it's really helpful. And if anyone's not seen it, it's a really helpful resource. So I'd encourage you watching it after this. But the overspending, debt, finances, money, benefits, all of those kinds of things are massively triggering, kind of as you approach what has become, I think, quite an intense financial period. Like, it's become a holiday where it's so much about gifting and buying stuff and excess. And, you know, I don't know if you can speak to that from your own experience.
I think so, and I think it's easy to get carried away. So it's kind of become extended, I think, with sort of Black Friday, and then you sort of have all the bargains that come in that sort of last weekend of November, and then it sort of continues into December. And I think it's sort of like pressure sometimes you feel to sort of be kind of the person that gives, and I think the nature of people quite often with bipolar is that sort of tendency to overspend or overgift, and be incredibly generous for people. And I think that's something is to remember. Actually, you don't have to. You can give smaller gifts. You can give homemade gifts, things that don't actually cost a lot to do. And I think it's to remember that it's not about the cost of the money that you're actually putting towards a gift. It's actually about more the thought behind it.
Yeah.
So if you can find ways to sort of do that type of thing, it depends if you're, I suppose, if you're very crafty, and if you're not, it might not particularly be the best suggestion in the world. But I think it's worth thinking about how you can, how you can reduce your budget or keep to a budget, and maybe it's about setting that budget to start with.
Mm.
I tend to be sort of, or have done in the past, to just go out very last minute and buy kind of presents, and then you kind of then buy extra present. You know, oh, that's nice, that's nice, that's nice, and I'll have 3 of those. So you end up with that sort of combined kind of big sort of expense come January. You're like, oh dear, that kind of wasn't really well budgeted. So I think if you can stick to a budget, that's probably my advice. Is just think about how much do you actually really want to spend over Christmas, and that can include, like, I mean, we touched on the food that you want to spend. Do you want to buy any drink? And things like that. I think it's how do you budget just for your festive period as well. Yeah, so it's worth thinking about, I think, ahead of it. Now it's kind of like, I think that's a bit of probably age and experience. I don't know, wisdom. I'll say that, and I'll probably go out the window this Christmas. But I think it's probably getting people more things that like experiences or something like that they're going to enjoy, rather than lots of sort of gifts that it's up to you. I mean, it's a very personal thing, isn't it, gifting? So I think it's how you kind of, like I say, can budget for that, but also what's important for you as the giver, and also what do you think people like. But remembering staying in a budget is useful.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think something that April touched on in the overspending webinar, which I thought was really powerful and resonated for me, even from that kind of loved one's perspective, was the emotional side of gift giving. Like when my loved one's not been very well, I want to give them a thing to show them that I love them, or, don't worry, we're going to get through this together. Look at these things I'm buying you. And I think sometimes thinking about your motivation behind spending, behind gift giving can be really beneficial before you make a financial decision. And I think as well, thinking, like you said, like whether or not I'm not very crafty, so people would definitely be devastated if I gave them a craft related gift. But giving people like personal gifts that are smaller but feel like something that lets you know that you know them. I know we have this like running joke about my deep-seated love of what's it. But anything like little snacky things, little gifts that remind you of them, anything like that, I think that's not as expensive, I think can fit well into the plan. And I think as well, something which I've talked about before when managing overspending is that if you know that you're like prone to overspending or compulsive spending or anything like that when you're not very well, giving yourself a smaller budget, you can still buy lots and lots of those things, but you're not spending as much money. And I think that's been really helpful. And I think what you're saying about planning is really important. I know you'll know this, but I grew up in quite a low income household, and so Christmas financially could be quite intense. And so something that we used to do, which I think is really helpful, is talk about it before it happened. So like in October, November, we'd know that this was like when you're writing your Christmas list for Father Christmas, when you're a little kid, or when you're a little bit older and you're talking about what you might want, you're given a budget beforehand. And I think when you're thinking about family spending or buying for lots of people or for Christmas spending on food, alcohol, etc., like pre-explaining to everyone who's going to be involved, so you don't feel weird about it when it comes to it, that you're not giving them enough, for want of a better word, I think is also helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I also think it's one of the things that's popped into my head is, like, if people do give you gifts and you're not overly enthused by them, and that's something to be polite about them, because I think it's easy to sort of, I mean, I've been on the receiving end of when people are sort of more or less throwing gifts back at me. So it's like, I don't like that. All right, well, you can change it. Here's the receipt. But I think it's remembering to be that sort of, just be gracious about if you get stuff that you don't particularly like as well, because I think sometimes it does occasionally happen. I remember being kids and that happening occasionally, looking at my brother's presents and going, I want Sabutio. Why's he got Sabutio? And I've got a typewriter. So it's kind of like, the typewriter came into its own about 3 years later. But it's kind of like, yeah, those sort of things is just remembering those sort of little things as well, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it is useful, isn't it? Sometimes useful asking people what they might like as well, so you don't go off at a tangent and get something completely would dislike. So
Yeah, and I think planning in advance as well has enabled me in the past to get things from like charity shops, Facebook Marketplace, pound shops. I bought one of my nieces, and I think this is easier with young children, is you get what my grandma would love when you called schmutter, but like little bits from like Poundland or like the middle aisle of Aldi or whatever. And they love it so much because I think kids love kind of stuff, but it's not expensive, and I think makes you feel like you're giving them something fun, something exciting, something interesting, and it works for adults as well. I bought some of my presents from like eBay and charity shops this year. um
I
you
know,
know
definitely. I think there's nothing wrong in that. You also help in a cause.
mm,
Yeah, so it's sort of enabling another organisation to do good work. So I think that's really important.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's really
Um,
positive. Well, and we talked a bit about travel. So I think time zones, if you're actually going away in terms of sort of overseas or something, then time zones can be really impactful on sleep. Because I noticed somebody put in the chat about having regular sleep patterns. Um, so I think that's one of the key things is how you stick to a bit of a routine around your day or sleep. And if you're traveling, that can get thrown out. So just mindful to try and filter that in, so factor that in even. So something that is, if you're going to be on a long journey, it's worth thinking about. Are you going to be able to get some extra sleep in somewhere? I'd say that.
yeah, definitely. And I think also even if you're not like going for it, like I live in Wales, I'll go to England for Christmas. It's not a million miles away. We're still in the same time zone, but the impact of the environment change on my sleep is massive. Like I go from being in a city here to a teeny tiny little village where, at night you can't see your hand in front of your face. And that's so I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not because it was too loud, but because it was too quiet.
Yeah.
And that was really like something I'd never thought of, something I'd never experienced until I started staying there. So the changing environment, I think, is really important. I mean, I know we did like a webinar on bipolar and sleep again, which was really good and which some people might want to catch up on. But I found setting up a routine which isn't always time specific, but is about like stuff I do, it seems to trick my brain into starting to be tired, even when, I don't have bipolar, I have a different mental health condition. And when I'm not very well, my sleep pattern is immediately out the window.
Mm.
But I found that even if it's like 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm really on edge, if I watch a little video, and I always watch the same types of videos, or I do the same type of meditation, or I clean my teeth or whatever, it helps trick your brain into being sleepy.
That's true. That's a good point in terms of sort of getting those kind of um, feelings and emotions, isn't it? Sort of thoughts going. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
Um, I also quite enjoy and I was promised I won't do it, but I always end up watching really late films and stuff, and then you get into that sort of nocturnal rhythm of kind of staying up quite late and then kind of like getting up later. So gradually, kind of day compresses. But yeah, I'll try not to do that this year. Famous last words. Yeah.
Do you find that if you're on like a Christmas break period, is there a kind of adjustment period that you put in for yourself when you're going back to work or anything? Because I feel like at Christmas, it can feel a bit like, your summer holidays when you're in high school, you can just like do whatever you want. And I don't know, do you find that you have to adjust around like moving back into the work or moving back into like a new year post Christmas
I would
schedule?
love to say yes to that. But anybody who knows me really well probably knows I'm not that organized. Um, yeah, I think it's something consciously I would say I would try to do. I think it's trying to kind of probably rinse out as much as possible out that holiday. So it's kind of like, let's live it up to the end. So yeah. But having said that, getting a bit older, went out for had 2 cocktails and just a meal the other night, and then come home and practically fell asleep. So that was a really wild night out. So I'm not sure I'm up to those kind of extremes anymore. But
Not going to
yeah,
go now raving anytime
yeah,
soon.
I don't think that's going to happen too much. But yeah, I think it's probably a kind of choice, getting back into that rhythm, isn't it? So,
Yeah, yeah. And I think as boring as it sounds, I find that the best thing for me to do is to just not let it move around too much because I
yeah,
find, I don't know about you, but I get, for me, it's a bit of like a slippery slope. It's, oh, well, it's a holiday. Normally I go to bed at 10, maybe I'll go to bed at 12. And then by the end of the week, it's like 4 a.m. and I'm wide awake. And I think I found that that does have a massive impact on how I'm feeling. And I just wanted to also add in for the people who are watching this um, the value of medication when you're thinking about your sleeping pattern.
yeah.
Like, especially when I've been poorly, it's been massive. And I know for my parent, they have PRNs, which are sleeping related, and that's also been, really important for them to help secure that sleeping pattern as much as they can.
I think that's yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, it'd be interesting from kind of just from a kind of friends and family perspective. Is there things that kind of help support somebody if they're struggling with sleep from that perspective? Because I think because it can also can have an impact on the friends and family, for example, if I'm not sleeping very well. So I appreciate that can be disruptive for their own sleep. So it's like, how from a friends and family would you recommend, or have you got any ideas that would help friends and family?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me and my parent, it's really been about talking about it with them and trying to figure out what might be going on, and then where I can help from there. So for them, their sleeping pattern changes most when they don't have a good routine,
Right.
because if you don't have a good routine, kind of like that summer holiday example I was using before, you can just kind of do whatever you want. And I think
Yeah.
often if you're the kind of person my parent is, the kind of person I can be, maybe some of the people watching, you like want to do stuff. You get to like 1 in the morning and you think, oh, this is the perfect time for me to, I don't know, repaint my kitchen or whatever.
Yeah.
And so putting into place routine, I think, is something that's really important for them. But equally for me as a family member, I need to be cognizant of the fact that I can't like handhold someone through their everyday. It's not good for them. They don't like it. I don't. I find it difficult and stressful sometimes. And so, what we'll often do is, like I said, have a conversation about why it might be happening. And as I said, the most common reason is that lack of routine. And then how can I help? Like maybe twice a week, do you want to come over for dinner so you have that structure at least? Or should I call you every evening or every morning or on my lunch break and we can have a talk, and that can be a point you center your day around? Or, is there like an event we can go to or a club I can help you join? Or, helping them find stuff they can do independently as well, I think is helpful. Um, I think sometimes the way that their sleep is impacted by their mood change is also really important, and we have a kind of separate plan for that, and it's like a kind of rappy type thing, like a wellness plan that I fit into. And so it's, as well as that, I think about using the resources that we've already set up, and that's why I saw somebody mention how important planning is in the chat. And I agree. I think planning as much as you can, just so you have stuff you can refer back to, because thinking on the fly as a family member, I find really stressful. And what I often find is that I'll end up doing the wrong thing because I haven't asked
Right.
them or planned, or. And then the only other thing I'd say is when you're talking about the disruption, it is disruptive when you're sleeping and the other person isn't sleeping. And so what we've done is just talked about it as and when it came up. And I think we've been fortunate enough that we've always been somewhere either with a garden or a spare room that they can go to and watch something on their phone or their laptop. Or we've bought headphones so that they can listen to that really loud music in the middle of the night without waking other people up. Or they smoke, so they'll go out into the garden for a cigarette and like kind of wander about that way. And it's something that they can do that isn't disruptive but also keeps them safe, because when they're not very well, they do have a bit, I think, unfortunately, of a habit of going out in the middle of the night and being outside in the streets, which worries me. So finding kind of alternatives for that has been really helpful.
Sounds like really good ideas.
Thank you.
It sounds like really helpful to support a sort of loved one or friends and family.
Mm.
I think it is something that you kind of like really thought about, and right, the planning is really helpful to that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I
really
have to say, I don't know that the planning is always, I have to be completely honest when I talk to people about that planning, is not always perfect. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we need to think on the fly, all that kind of thing. But I think just doing as much planning as you can. And also learning from your experiences. Like you mentioned that you have a knowledge about the way your condition affects you. And so thinking about those experiences and using them to teach you what might happen moving forward, I find really helpful.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think kind of if you've got visitors coming to you as well, it's a kind of slightly different perspective than you going to stay with other people or visit other people. So it's kind of how you manage that and manage those kind of stresses. If you're the person preparing the lunch or providing, is it that those sort of experiences can be challenging, or it's sort of is it a shared experience, is it, or is it all the pressure on you? So I think that's something to think about as well, how you're going to manage visitors. So if you've got um, sometimes things go off without a hitch, but it's also remembering that, you know, planning for those times when it does, isn't it? It's making sure. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think thinking about maybe, you know, this is something to another one of the triggers is like, who are those visitors or people you're going to stay with, and what is your relationship like with them? Like, I don't know about you, but some of my family have like a really good understanding of bipolar and some of them really don't. And I think depending on who you're going to engage with, it can be a time when you connect with a support network who understand you and provide care and love, or it can be a time when you're on edge and things can be a bit combative. And you know, I don't know how you navigate that from your own experiences. You know, what do you do when you're having to see people who maybe aren't understanding about your condition or your experiences or your loved ones' experiences?
I think that's kind of what I was alluding to a bit in earlier on, is don't expect people to understand what you are going through, or what because your kind of particular day might be quite difficult for you personally. So it doesn't mean because it's Christmas you're going to have a better day or a good day, and hopefully you are, but you could have phases within that day or that bank holidays where you're actually having sort of mixed episodes, or you're up and down, or there's other kind of impacts on you. So I think one of the sort of choices I made quite a long time ago, after kind of some of those experiences, and the stress that other people are going through, just to have this sort of perfect Christmas, and getting engaged into not as part of anything to do with me or to do with bipolar, but just because they were having complete stress and domestic over putting this kind of perfect Christmas on. So I kind of made a decision a while ago that actually those things aren't helpful, just in terms of enjoying your own self. So so I don't like particularly staying over again with. If I was going to do something, I think I'd probably go away on holiday. But I think it's actually, what do you enjoy? So one of the kind of learnings or takeaways for me was, what do I really enjoy, and what enables me to take a break or rest? So and that might just be having a local lunch with some friends or family or extended family, but it might not involve that complete going away, staying over, etc. So I'd say think about what you enjoy, what actually enables you to enjoy the day, whether you celebrate Christmas or not, whether you're just celebrating a bank holiday or enjoying a sort of time off. Just think about what you want from it. And if you need to be selfish, and take yourself out of it. So I think, you know, you can still do things with other people, but you can also do it on your terms. That makes sense. So just because I think sometimes we all sort of feel a bit beholden, or must do the same thing every year with certain people. Actually, sometimes taking a different approach which suits you is sometimes more helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my like most favorite things to think about when I'm thinking about my life in general, not only related to bipolar, but in general, is you don't get a reward for suffering. You don't have to put yourself in these positions. And I think as an adult, like you're saying, exercising as much kind of your right to choose as you possibly can, thinking about yourself first, thinking about your well-being first is so vital. Like similarly to you, when I was younger, I'd feel like a lot of pressure to stay over and be somewhere for like a week or weeks on end, or do all of these different activities. And as a grown up, don't want to brag, but I'm grown up now. And being able to to exercise my own kind of right to make that decision. So maybe it's not a week anymore, maybe it's a day or 2 days, or maybe we don't do something at your home, we do something at mine, or in a separate public location, or maybe I think as well the kind of self-care aspect is really important, particularly if you don't have as much choice. So like I'd often, when I had to stay somewhere for longer periods of time, it would be about carving out, kind of like what you said at the beginning, actually, Rosie, but like carving out private time for myself. So within a day, I'd have a shower in the morning and deliberately just be in the room getting ready for much longer than I needed to while I listened to something or watched something. Or, I think putting into place some kind of self-care structure is really important. But like you're saying, if you really don't want to do something, you don't actually have to. I think that's like a really surprising thing to realize sometimes. Is actually I don't have to do that.
I know. I think that's when you come. Yeah, I often think that's a sort of adult choice, isn't it? I don't have to. I don't have to do this anymore. So yeah, I used to have cousins that used to do that. I spent Christmas on their own quite a lot, and kind of I couldn't understand it when I was younger. I was like, "No, why are you doing that?" But actually, as I got older, I kind of understood it. And then equally, kind of balancing that with doing stuff with friends and family is useful. Um,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
liked in the chat, somebody's just put you can explain to your communicate with your friend and family and loved ones about getting overwhelmed. I think Helen's put that in the chat. So I think that's a good point. So if you have that ability to communicate and relationship, I think that's really important.
yeah, definitely. I think that's being able to communicate, being clear and open. I think if you are somebody who has a family who you struggle to communicate with, something I don't know if it's the healthiest thing ever, but helps in the short term is avoiding those conversations. So if there are topics, especially around, mental health, because I think it's so sensitive, because I think it impacts like all of us so personally. If I know that somebody isn't understanding or holds beliefs that I don't agree with, or I think sometimes it's also about anger. Like I think some people react inappropriately to someone they care about not being well. And instead of doing, what I have chosen to do, and again, I think it's partially about choice, which is to understand the condition and plan and build and all that kind of thing, they're furious and they don't actually want to engage with it. And when you do try and engage with them with it, it can be quite unhelpful. And so, I think avoiding, finding safe topics of conversation, I think those things are also really helpful for me anyway.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And somebody else has mentioned, yeah, similar thing with headphones. You mentioned noise is earplugs if you get disturbed by loud noises. So things like that can also help. The
Yeah.
other thing I think is, whether or not you have to work over the bank holidays, I think it's kind of like remembering it kind of there's this big pressure and build up, but it is over quite quickly. So it's kind of like I think sometimes we're kind of very focused on these type of events that do become overwhelming because there's so much build up on kind of TV adverts in the news, the rest of it, and that sort of pressure to go out and spend becomes into that. I think so. It is over in terms of remembering that it's for a short period. So it's like how do you want to engage with that and spend your time with that?
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
it's
And
also
I think it helps with the crash afterwards as well. Like I found when I was a kid, I mean, even though my family doesn't celebrate Christmas, but I'd see it on television and I'd get all excited about it, and I'd be really like, I'm quite an intense person anyway, but I think even more so when I was younger, and I just really build it up in my brain, and then it would happen. I'd be almost disappointed. And I found that post Christmas crash was really hard. And I tried, I think, as a grown up, to think about it like almost like Valentine's Day. Like I love my partner on that day, but I also love them all the rest of the time. And so, I think it's hard if your family isn't super accessible to you, or your friends aren't super accessible to you, because Christmas then becomes about that. And I think that adds an additional level of pressure. But I think thinking about it, like you said, as an event within the year rather than the only event of the year, I think can be
yeah.
helpful.
And I kind of wanted to touch on because I think sort of it's a bit of a good segue into talking about being alone. But also, I think, like you said, you can be in a relationship and you can be lonely in terms of, so it's not always the kind of festive effectiveness of just creating a sense of being lonely. But I know some people see that in terms of this is the sort of ultimate, perfect kind of adverts are always on TV with that the um, kind of family that's identified as what kind of demonstrates this kind of unit that kind of celebrates Christmas. And if you don't have that, then there's something it's not quite right, which actually is not true. So people experience those kind of holiday periods and events and anniversaries in different ways. And also there's a big, if you've lost somebody during the period or before Christmas in this year, or even prior to that, I think anniversaries like Christmas can be a big trigger. So it's remembering those sort of things can also be a time to remember people, but they can also be a time when loss comes up for people. So I think that's worth a little bit of thinking about in terms of how that impacts you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think, like I said, my family doesn't celebrate Christmas. And so some of them would be unfortunately alone. And something that we ended up talking about, and a few people did, was something just for them that they find enjoyable. So putting into place like self-care for them. So I know my grandma used to drive, it was the winter, and I think about this and I think, why would you do this? But she did it anyway. She used to make a little picnic and she used to drive to like Hyde Park on Christmas Day and go and have a little picnic. And that was like her little thing that she did every year. And so, my grandpa would go with her and they'd do it together, but sometimes it would be something that she would do alone throughout the year as well. And I think for them, it was about just having something that you can do. And I think if you can as well, build in a bit of time to connect with people who understand you, whatever that looks like. So, I know like a lot of people use our e-community over Christmas because it gives them a space to connect with people who do understand, and it can, I think, help with that social aspect, and also with the kinds of things that you're talking about, like you're somewhere where people don't understand you, or it's not a structure that you're completely comfortable with, or you have a lot of emotions that come out of that. And I know from experience, like when I was a kid, sometimes the living in a very low income household does change your expectations for Christmas, and then you feel guilty about it and you don't know who to talk about. And so finding someone who can talk about it with you, I think is really important. And I think as well, from like a loved one's perspective, if you find that that Christmas is related to like memories of your loved one being unwell, I think that's also really important to remember and to put into place some kind of self-care. Like if they were, last Christmas or Christmas 10 or 15 years ago, they were in hospital, being reminded of that all the time, I think can be very hard. And so, making sure that you put into place those structures for yourself. And I think as well, the other side of that coin, like something we see talked about on our e-community is, well, last Christmas I was really unwell, and so I'm really worried about this Christmas, or this is the anniversary of something that happened, or like my first episode or something like that. I think you're right. Like sometimes a lot of the conversations about Christmas that you see happening publicly are like merry and jolly and lovely, and sometimes Christmas isn't like that for you. And I think, building that in, prepping for it, putting into place self-care, when you're thinking about someone that you love who you may have lost, I think I found it helpful in our family to put into place a plan for a specific time frame. This makes me sound like I organize everything in my life. I don't, but like a specific time to grieve them in the day. So visit the grave, or spend a time and have a drink for them, thinking about them, I found really helpful.
I think all those sort of things are really, really nice. And just it's a sort of just recognition, isn't it? And taking that little bit of time to remember. And somebody else has popped into the chat, which I think is really good, is helping other people in a sense of loneliness is also an issue for some, getting involved in local charity care home. So Helen popped that in the chat. Church with others can be different, helping other people, beneficial. Fulfillment. And Amelia's got a good question. Have you had the experience of a loved one not wanting to follow the tips of planning and routine tips? What is helpful in this case? Oh, that's a good question.
Yes. It might be helpful for both of us to answer kind of from both of our perspectives. But in my own experience, yes, definitely. I think it's incredibly frustrating. It's really worrying, and it can feel overwhelming. And I think there can be a lot of, I don't know if you're anything like me, panic. There was a plan and now there's not a plan, and oh my goodness, what do I do? And what if I do something that's wrong, or I upset them, or I overstep, or I miss something? And I think if you have the experience of a loved one being very unwell, and this happens to me, is, oh my goodness, what if something happens to them and I never see them again? And that's something that's really scary and does make you prone to panic. And so I think the first thing to do is just give yourself a few minutes or a day or whatever it is feasible within the well-being of your loved one, and just have a bit of a break. And then maybe look at what is realistic for you. So like I said, me and my loved one have a plan. It's great, love the plan, but as I said, not always an effective thing. And I think that's just the reality of caring about somebody who has a mental health condition, and it's also the reality of caring about an adult who has the freedom to do whatever they want. My parent is also quite a stubborn person, and so that I think can merge with them not being very well. Sometimes they can be suspicious or paranoid, and that can make things more difficult for us when we're trying to think about how we help them. So like I said, we have a plan, we try and follow it wherever possible, but if they don't follow it, I try very, very hard to respect that as their choice. So that's the kind of central thing for me, is I am not like a superhuman person. I can't make them different. I can't force them into a corner or make them do something that they don't want to do. And also it wouldn't be appropriate for me and in my relationship to do that. So I try and respect their choice. I try and respect the limitations that I have, so I'm not overburdening myself or stressing myself out, and I'm being realistic with myself about what is actually possible for me. And then I think about it in, I think, actually quite a clinical way. So I'm trying to give you 10 of these things and you want 2 of them, or you want none of them, or whatever. Okay, you've made that decision. I'm going to now redirect some of those things to me. So I'm going to redirect it so I'm supporting myself more. Maybe I'm attending a support group, going on the forum, talking to someone on the phone, talking to a friend, my partner, giving my cats a little hug, whatever. And then I think about, as I said, quite clinically, about their physical safety. So yes, they don't want me to help them with this plan. Fine, that's their decision. But I don't, if they're not very well, I try and think about keeping them physically safe as a basic minimum. And then just kind of keep an eye on them. And if things get to crisis point, then I think now it's time for me to get involved. I don't know if that was clear or made sense, but I think that's kind of what we've had to do. Is it's impossible for you as a loved one to do everything all the time. It's unfair. And I think with my experience with my loved one, they don't actually want that from me. And so I'm overstepping and making them uncomfortable and trying to be like all kind of in their business. So doing what I can. If they don't want it, that's their decision, and I'll only then fully step in again if I feel like there's a crisis. But in that interceding period, looking after their physical safety and redirecting some of that energy to myself. All you can do is try. You can't be a superhuman person, and I'm sure that they appreciate everything that you're trying to do, or will do in time.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it's I think looking after yourself is really high on the agenda, because you can't, like you say, do everything all the time. I think that's super important to remember. And you will have those moments, like you've said, where it doesn't work or it's not working for some reason, and you can only look after yourself. But also, like you say, when it gets to the critical point, is then perhaps the time when you get involved. And then respecting autonomy. And sometimes you will come out of that yourself. So even if you don't like the plan at the time, but you're not that unwell, you sometimes just will come out of whatever's going on for you yourself, and then sort of come back around, if that makes sense. So I think it's remembering, sort of from my experience, I'll probably get cajoled to go for a walk and things like that, which sometimes land well, sometimes don't. So I kind of will take myself out if I need to, if that is feeling like a little bit too intense. So I think it's worth remembering how you yourself in those moments, if you're lucid enough to remember to look after yourself, or if you're living with bipolar. So yeah, I think that's something to think about.
Yeah, definitely. It's
So
hard.
Helen's put an agreement with you, Money. You can't. Katsa completely agrees. You can't pour from an empty cup. You must take care of yourself. Otherwise, you might become unwell. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, good point.
yeah. Usually so. If anyone has any more questions, we've got about 10 minutes. We've got a few other topics that we can cover, but if anyone wants to pop any messages in the chat, just let us know. And while we're waiting, Rosie, I don't know about you, but I was thinking maybe some of those like extraneous or extraneous to us outside of the Bipolar UK world triggers that I think can be helpful. So they were food, drugs, and alcohol. I know that came up. I mean, I don't know, as I said, I don't know if you have anything that you found helpful when you're thinking about that.
I think that's a feed from one of our kind of former colleagues who live with bipolar used to talk about James. He often used to talk about having sort of a few things that you can just graze on. But sometimes I know appetite can be an issue. So it's just having something like maybe some nice fruit or nuts around, just something that you can graze on that you might not want a full meal. And those sort of things can be helpful, I think, with food. But also quite often, if you're not living on a budget, that's something to think about is what you're going to enjoy to eat. But also if you're on a bit of a budget, then it's also looking at what's your best options on that front. But I would say, yeah, look after your sort of options to have a little bit of a graze rather than having to think about full cooking or full meals, because sometimes, like I say, with bipolar, you can have a bit of a appetite dip. And I don't always think sort of you want to go for a big cookout or you want to have a large meal, so or even a small meal. But yeah, he always used to recommend that if people were suffering with any appetite issues, which I think is quite sensible. So that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, if you're someone who, as well as your diagnosis or your loved one's diagnosis of bipolar, is struggling with anything eating related, I think before Christmas comes, especially if it's related to like anything disordered, before Christmas comes, speak to someone like Beat and like
Yeah,
try and work with an organization who's there to support with that kind of thing, to help you find a plan forward that works well for you. I think that's something that ran through a lot of the conversations I've had within services as a loved one. And, I think for lots of other people we speak to is recognize you're not, it's not your responsibility to be like a doctor or therapist for yourself or for anyone else. And so
yeah,
knowing where your limit is and getting that specialist help and support, I think is really helpful. And I agree with you as well. I find like when I'm not feeling well, and my loved one will often say when they're not feeling well, food and spending hours cooking, and you just don't want to.
yeah.
Having little
Yeah.
bits is really nice.
We'll just have sort of as well, maybe in the cupboard, a soup or some soups that you can just pop on, and they're not too difficult to sort of prep either. So I think those sort of things can be useful.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I think the sort of drugs and alcohol we touched on. I suppose it's like everything in moderation if you can, in terms of what is the impact likely to have on you, and the risk factors in terms of does it escalate your mood, does it decrease your mood? So I suppose it's kind of what are the risk factors, and do you feel like you can make those decisions ahead of the time in a sense? I think it's
yeah.
easy. It's easy to kind of. I think it's easy at this time of year to overindulge,
Mm.
but sometimes that's if it's not having a massive impact, it's like I suppose it is what is the consequential risk factor.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for food in particular, I feel that way because I think sometimes inadvertently we like moralize food as being really good or really bad, and then you end up with this kind of emotional cycle around food, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of pressure because food is such a big part of Christmas, you have to do it this way, and that becomes overwhelming. I think for drugs and alcohol, I've talked about this before. I had a dual diagnosis, so I managed my mental health with drugs. And I was put through a program through my GP, and it was excellent and terrifying to talk about and really, really helpful. So I think I would say if you are concerned about yours or a loved one's drug or alcohol usage, talk to your GP, talk to organizations like Drinkline and just get a bit of advice about what to do. But for me, when I was thinking about managing my drug usage, it was about knowing that I couldn't put myself in situations when I would be triggered. So like Christmas involves a lot of parties and nights out and all that kind of thing. And I would stop going to them in the same way. So I go with smaller groups of friends, I go to different places. And I would also think about how I was feeling. So what you said about like monitoring your mood is so important because it helps you understand how like risky, for want of a better word, you are. Because when I was feeling okay, I my relationship with drugs and alcohol was very different.
Yeah.
And so, I think knowing how you're feeling and thinking about that when you're making decisions around Christmas. And also, if you don't feel well and you know that spending a bit of time by yourself helps and it's Christmas Day and you've made a promise, it's okay to say that actually you don't want to. I don't feel well, like Helen was saying, like you said, Rosie, communicating openly and honestly with your loved ones. I think drug and alcohol usage can be hard in the same way that mental health is hard to talk about to your loved ones. So, I think it wasn't uncommon in my experience for it to not be, I'm struggling with these feelings, but actually I have a bit of a cold and I don't want to make you unwell, so I'm going to stay at home. Like it ended up being, I think, a little bit of a white lie. But I think being open and honest with yourself and other people wherever you can, and kind of knowing your risk level and acting based on that, I think was really, really helpful for me.
Yeah, that sounds kind of really positive. I think Helen has mentioned that communicating openly as well with friends and family. I think that was. We got a couple of last minute questions.
Okay.
What about overindulgence? I often eat when feeling high or low. So this is from that. Christmas is hard not to overindulge. So you get into a routine with diet at work, but kind of goes out the window at Christmas. And at various events, etc. And then Marcus is saying, how have you managed to build a routine structure for yourself and stick with it? Are you strict with this? Is it just general guide? I think Christmas is very difficult to not overindulge. And I think I'd probably say a lot of people outside the bipolar community as well as inside probably find that period, because there is sort of like this intense pressure to kind of a little bit overshot, a little bit extra dishes are around that you might not normally have throughout the year. So I think it is quite difficult not to overindulge. I suppose it's like, is there any sort of trade-offs? So some of those sort of things can be maybe an extra walk in the day. Is there anything that you can others to help you? So sometimes it's about saying, okay, do you mind if we don't eat until a certain time, and or if we eat earlier, but then you don't have those extra snacks in the evening like the giant Wotsits we've always talked about. So
My favorite.
yeah, so I think it's very hard. I'm not going to say that's easy, or that I'm not guilty of it. That's a word, isn't it? I shouldn't use that word. Why are we guilty if we overindulge? But I think it's the time of year when it does happen. So it's kind of like, what does January look like? And I know a lot of people do dry January and things like that. So it's maybe there's trade-offs that, yes, you allow yourself to have a bit of an overindulgence, and not see it as something that's too bad, but just look at any trade-offs that come up in that you can do as a result. So and that might be changing your routine up in January and going back to your work routine where you don't have to worry so much about overindulging, but you're more back in that sort of eating habits that you're used to.
Yeah.
I think building a routine, I'd say, Marcus, is quite difficult in structure. Again, sort of maybe having those meal tracker, things like that can help. Maybe making yourself a bit of a wrap plan, to-do list. I know one of our volunteers always used to say, especially if their mood was quite low, they'd have a to-do list, even if they tick one thing off it in the day. It's quite useful. It just sort of like is that little bit of motivation. So it's worth thinking about what would help you. And maybe have a call with us or go on the community, ask that question with other people that will also be very understanding in terms of what that means for them as well. What does that
Yeah.
look like? And what would help you? Maybe behind that question there's a sort of what would really help you. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think around the kind of overindulgence question, I think what you said is really important, Rosie, is like being forgiving with yourself. It's not like you overindulge at some events and then kind of the rest of your year is completely out the window. I think, you know, being soft with yourself, knowing that it's about the time of year often. I think, Matt, what you said about your mood being related to the way that you overindulge might also be helpful to think about. Like if you're finding it's happening in response to your mood, is there anything that extra that you could be doing around this time of year to help support with that mood change? Like, are there extra self-management tips? Are there extra routines, or, you know, medical support or loved one support or whatever that is that can help you with that kind of mood change if you're finding that they're connected? And the only other thing I would say is, you say that like there's like a good routine at work. Between the events that you mentioned, can you adhere to that routine as much as possible? So, you know, say you wake up at X time, you have breakfast at X time, lunch at X time, dinner at X time, go to bed at X time with when you're at work. Can you retain at least some of that while you're at home? You know, because I think having a little bit of a routine, even if it's not the full whack, can be really helpful in, like I said, just kind of keeping that structure, and that might help with things, you know, so that when you're at an event, it's different than what you'd be doing at work, but maybe you can still go to bed at the same time or wake up the next day at the same time, etc. And for Marcus's question, I think, yeah, speak to people in the e-community about what they do around routine. I think I've built my routine with my loved one and for my own mental health through practice, trial and error. So I don't think when we first started it was like the perfect one. I think what we tended to do is be quite responsive in the beginning, and then you build something and you know what works, and involving other people in that, because sometimes they have different insight, different perspective into your early warning signs than you do, or to your like behavior or mood change or whatever it might be that can be helpful to include. But I think as well, you said like, am I strict with it, or is it just a general guide? And for me, I'm never strict with it because that's not realistic. I find that if I'm too strict, and then I don't achieve it, I feel like I failed, and that makes me feel worse, and that's really unhelpful for me. So like Rosie said about having a to-do list, I have something similar. I have on my fridge, I bought it, a massive whiteboard, and it's got all the days of the week and then like a big notes section. And at the beginning of every week, I set things up that way, and that's helpful. It's just like one task a day or whatever. And then for my other routine, like I said, I try and be flexible, and it's the same thing with my loved one, is we try and be flexible as much as possible. There are some key things like waking up, like lunch, dinner times, and going to bed, which are for me the most impactful, so I stick to them the most, and then the other things I'm kind of a bit more laissez-faire about. But I also, it is massively flexible depending on how I'm feeling. So like when I'm very depressed, getting out of bed is an achievement, having a shower is an achievement, and it's not going to be like go to Tesco's, empty the bins, do the cat litter, you know, talk to my mum, whatever. It's going to be one thing. And so I think being flexible with how you're feeling is also really important. And so for me, yeah, it's not strict. It is just a bit of a guide, which I find very helpful. But yeah.
Thanks, Molly. I think don't be too hard on yourself if your routine doesn't, like you said, fit even.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, I don't know about you, Rosie, I think we've come to the end now. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As we said, this will be recorded, so you will get sent a recording when it's ready. It'll be up on the website when it's ready for you to share, for you to revisit. I just wanted to, before I pass over to Rosie to kind of hear anything you have to say, as a closing comment, just to say thank you, everyone, for sharing, for coming, for listening. I think whether or not you celebrate Christmas, this is a really tough time of year. And so I think making sure you look after yourself and you try and do at least one thing that you want to do and that you enjoy and feels good for you. And I think the last thing I'd say is listening to us have this conversation, though I hope it was helpful, can also sometimes be a bit draining. So whatever it is you do this afternoon and over this weekend, make sure that it's something that makes you feel safe and comfortable and warm, hopefully, 'cause it's very cold where I am. And thank you. And I'll pass over to you, Rosie.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks for joining today. And everybody's joined us. Enjoy your time, whatever you're up to, and treat yourself to something nice if you can afford it. Just an affordable gift over the period, that's always useful. And if you can't, gift yourself something that you can do free. So it might be free time, taking yourself some nice self-care time that you can gift yourself, and yeah, look after yourself. So
Thank you.
enjoy. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. We'll put some information in the chat and in the email that goes out after this about our services over Christmas and about our Christmas campaign, which you can either share or donate to, depending on what's going on with you. And please do join our e-community so you can continue this conversation. Thanks, everyone. Happy Christmas. Bye.
Bye.